Hello and welcome to another episode of Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
And hi, I'm Nick Butcher.
And in today's episode, we're going to talk about 10 more navigation anti-patterns. And when we say 10 more, we say that because we actually recorded a previous episode of the show where we went into 10 of the most common UX issues, user experience issues that we saw. And some of those issues were specifically related to navigation. So in this episode, we'll talk about 10 more navigation anti-patterns that we've since kind of thought about, since that episode. Nick, do you want to kind of talk a little bit more about the background here?
Yeah, sorry, of course. If you didn't catch a previous episode, we kind of went into the background that part of our job is to work with a bunch of partners and look at all kinds of applications out there. And we come across all kinds of issues and variations on the patterns, some of which kind of work, some of which don't. One of the things we often see is when people are new to Android design, they quickly pick up things like the visual language of Android, but they sometimes don't completely internalize the navigation patterns and completely kind of grasp the nuances of some of the consequences of deviating from these patterns. So we wanted to give you the benefit of all this experience and highlight some of the pitfalls we've come across and what you should watch out for and what you can do instead.
Exactly. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so 10 more navigation anti-patterns. The first that we're going to talk about is navigation in the action bar overflow. So this is getting to be less and less common, which is great. But the idea here is that some of the apps that we've seen have put their primary navigation. So, for example, home, store, my items, different categories, browse, things like that. Basically, kind of like the core way to navigate your app. They've put this all into the action bar overflow, and this is really kind of the wrong place to put your navigation. There are a number of reasons for this. I mean, the most common, I guess, the major reason is that now most apps don't do this. Most apps follow the guidelines and use more standard UI patterns for exposing their top-level navigation. We'll obviously talk about those. Things like the navigation drawer, things like tabs. But really, this is the wrong place to put it. Another reason is actually on older devices that don't have the action bar overflow, it would be hidden under the menu button. And there are lots of issues with the menu button, the hardware menu button. We won't get into all of them today, but this is definitely one of the kind of one of the navigation anti-patterns that we thought was pretty common, but luckily it's getting less and less common.
Yeah, generally it kind of goes against the organization of having navigation on the left and actions on the right, and that all the other apps on the platform are training users to look for. So, users not finding certain sections of your apps, if you follow this pattern, it could be that they're just looking for it elsewhere.
So the second navigation anti-pattern that we want to talk about today is using UI patterns in the wrong order, or kind of having the wrong navigational hierarchy. So we have a couple of major UI patterns for exposing navigation. Things like the navigation drawer, the action bar spinner, and tabs, action bar tabs, or just regular tabs. So there's actually a pretty strict ordering with how you should use these, in which order you should use them. And basically, when you look at your app in terms of its informational hierarchy, you'll generally create something like a tree, right? So at the top you'll have home, at the second level you'll have your major sections, and then within each section you may have subsections and so on. So one of the things that we've actually seen a handful of apps do is use these different UI patterns to represent different levels of that information hierarchy. Now, the wrong thing to do would be to use, say, tabs to represent the top level, and then the action bar spinner to represent, say, the next level, and then, for example, the navigation drawer to represent the third or deepest level. So this is actually just kind of the wrong way to do it. On Android, these three UI patterns actually follow a pretty rigid level, or a pretty rigid hierarchy. So instead of doing something like this, the correct hierarchy would actually be to always have the navigation drawer represent the topmost level of your application hierarchy. And then, if you have an action bar spinner, that should be the second level. And finally, if you have tabs, it should be the third level. Now, if you don't have a spinner, if you just have a navigation drawer and tabs, such as with Google Play Music, then it would just be the navigation drawer and then tabs. But really, your tabs and your spinner should never precede the drawer. The drawer always should represent the topmost level of your application hierarchy.
So this is a somewhat contrived example that we have 3 different levels of hierarchy, of navigation hierarchy in this application. You probably would generally want to avoid that. Perhaps you might do something like having 2 levels of hierarchy in your drawer via a collapsible section, which we'll cover in a section. But if you do have that kind of complex hierarchy, then do respect this. You generally want to go for a kind of a top downward scan. So the highest level, is a natural mapping to the root of your navigation. One thing, kind of wrinkle, I guess, is you'll see here that the drawer is obviously underneath the action bar. The difference being that when you open the drawer, the action bar is expected to transform. So in this instance, you would get kind of only app-wide options. So in this case, the spinner would disappear. You'd probably just have the application name itself, and any actions not relevant to the entire application should disappear from there. So yeah, generally follow that top-down approach and you'll be okay.
And another thing with the drawer is that we did have another episode specifically about using the navigation drawer, and we had, I believe, Rich Fulcher and Jens Nagel from the Android design team that talked a little bit about how to use the drawer and in which cases it's most useful. So definitely take a look at that episode if you have more questions about using the drawer. Okay, with that, let's move on.
Absolutely. So the next pattern that we wanted to cover is talking about tabs. So tabs in Android have a very kind of strong mental link to horizontal swipe. So whenever you see tabs, you kind of absolutely expect to be able to horizontally swipe between content. So for that reason, if you do have some kind of paginated content, you do want to be careful about putting that within tabs. Because you're going to have some swipe ambiguity. When you see a tab, you expect to be able to swipe to change between them, not to move the content within it.
So one thing to add here is that if it's a part of the tab, it's maybe like a small section that's swipeable. Let's say you have horizontally scrolling photo gallery or something like that. If it's a part of the tab, then it's generally okay. There are cases where it's possible to kind of do this. It's just the issue here is that the entire tab contents are another left and right swipe region, and so it creates this kind of ambiguity between, am I swiping between tabs or am I swiping between pages? In cases like if you have a map where it's not really swiping between pages, you're kind of panning a surface, it's also okay, but it's again something that you may want to rethink because there will be that ambiguity. But in this case, I mean, this is just kind of one of those textbook cases, I guess, of ambiguity, kind of really messing with the standard Android pattern or standard Android interaction of tabs being directly linked with their content. So instead of doing this, another way to, I guess, solve this issue is to, instead of doing horizontal paging, you can kind of do a vertical scrolling type thing for the tab contents. So basically, anytime you have nested horizontal swiping, really try to think, is there a better way to present this? Maybe it's breaking out the content into a separate screen. Maybe it's using a different interaction, vertical scrolling versus horizontal paging. But really kind of think about that, because that is something that can create that ambiguity. So the next anti-pattern that we're going to talk about is deep or persistent tabs. These often go hand in hand. So first, let me talk about deep tabs. When we say deep tabs, we really talk about, I guess we compare deep versus shallow tabs. On Android, tabs should be shallow. What that means is that there shouldn't be too much navigation within tabs. Maybe you have like a view switch, like maybe like change the sort order or something, or something like that. Or maybe you have scrolling and whatever, but you really shouldn't have any sort of hierarchy or history within a tab. What that means is, in this example, let's say you're looking at the contents of a tab and you select one of these grid items. You should take the user to a new screen. You shouldn't actually take the user or update the contents of the tab with whatever you just clicked on. And then when you press back, it would go back here. This is not something you want to do. This is actually something we would call a deep tab, a tab that has hierarchy or history. And so, the reason for this, I guess, is that First of all, this is just kind of a platform norm. This is not something that's generally done on Android. But the second thing is that, what happens when you swipe to other tabs or switch between different tabs? You actually leave your tabs in all sorts of weird states. And the behavior of what happens when you get back to that tab isn't really well defined. I mean, should you reset the tab back to its top level? Should you, stay where it is? You really kind of don't want to have too much state going on. Really, this is actually a recurring theme. When your app has too much state that the user has to keep in mind, or can be too much state that's maybe unexpected to the user, that's going to result in kind of confusion. So these are things you want to avoid. And so for that reason, we generally consider tabs as shallow on Android. Another similar point here is persistent tabs. So persistent tabs are basically tabs that behave like global navigation that are always there throughout your app. And so, the problem with this, and they can either be on the top or the bottom. When they're on the bottom, that's even worse because, again, tabs on Android should be at the top. But persistent tabs, regardless of where they are problematic because, that's not really how global navigation should work on Android, especially with things like the back button. What happens when you switch between tabs and then kind of, do stuff within tabs? The back button behavior is no longer really well defined. And so it's not really a platform norm, as well as kind of, there's a lot of confusion that will result from it to have tabs that are persistent across the app. And for that reason, one of the reasons that we created the navigation drawer was to allow apps to create these kind of global context switch type UI patterns or UIs, where to switch between some deep part of one section to a whole other section of the app. You can use the navigation drawer, which is available through an edge swipe. So really, I guess to summarize this very long-winded argument, avoid persistent tabs that are there throughout, and avoid deep tabs, basically tabs that have hierarchy. Anything to add, Nick, before we move on?
I think you covered that pretty well.
Okay, well, let's do it. You want to talk about, actually, real quick.
This is what you should do.
Yes, that's right. We had some examples of ways to mitigate this. So in this previous example, you had your tabs, show the contents of the thing you just clicked on. In this next example, instead of showing the tabs, you basically take the user to a whole new screen with a whole new action bar and an up caret or an up button. And then to get back to where the user just was, they would just press the up button. And then, of course, if you have a navigation drawer, you can always expose it here through an edge swipe. So that's deep and persistent tabs. Nick, do you want to talk about back traversing across tabs?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Roman was saying about having these kind of shallow tabs, we also consider moving between tabs to be kind of a very lightweight action. It's not something that's going to actually drop history, as it were, drop something into your kind of navigation history. So therefore, the back button should not unwind your moving between tabs like this. So in this example here, if you're on the third tab and you were to kind of tap or swipe between them, tapping back shouldn't unwind you. In fact, if you kind of embrace the fact of having swipe between it would feel pretty unnatural for a tap of a back button to unwind a swipe button. So that's one of the reasons why we say not to do that.
Exactly. And a similar area where the back button shouldn't do maybe what you think it should do is when you're changing between different drawer sections. So for the drawer, you may think if I switch from section 1 to section 3 to section 4, pressing back should switch between those. But actually, the platform standard here, again, for the back button, is basically when you switch between sections in the drawer, you should actually reset your task stack. It's almost like you've entered in a different app. And that's really what the navigation drawer is good for. If you look at an example like Google Plus, for example, the Google Plus app, when you switch between different sections, you're almost entering different apps. And the navigation drawer is really good at these types of scenarios. But really, kind of the guidance here is when you switch between sections in the drawer, you should the pressing back should probably either kick you out of the app, or if your users are getting confused by why is this leaving the app, it should maybe take you to the topmost section. So for example, home. So if I go between home and browse and search and store and categories, pressing back from categories should really only take me back to home and then to the home screen, or just the home screen. Anything to add, Nick, before we move on?
No, I was just going to say that's a really powerful point, I think, is that if you do have one natural home, one place which you always expect users to want to come in on and probably get back to very, very easily, it's okay to have one level of back kind of inserted into that fresh task stack to take them back through that. So they have that stability of really easily getting back to that natural kind of home position from a subsection.
Exactly.
But otherwise, yeah, kind of treat changing sections similar to kind of changing tabs. It's not kind of a history event.
All right, let's move on. Deep navigation drawers. You want to cover this one, Nick?
Yeah, next one is one of my pet hates. It's probably a smell, really, that if you're having to do this pattern here of having deep navigation structures in your drawer, it probably means your kind of navigation needs to be simplified somewhat and maybe perhaps broken up into different sections or different applications perhaps, or something like this. But the idea of the navigation drawer is it's a stable list of navigation targets which you can always kind of get to and jump between stuff. And you don't want to put any kind of cognitive load on the user to actually kind of remember where they were or where they've kind of gone through. It wants to be a stable thing that when I open up the drawer, I know I can I have my home option, I have whatever option to navigate to. So you want to avoid having different steps, or I've even seen like kind of secondary drawers popping out from the first drawer, which is also pretty crazy. So yeah, do try and avoid this. An alternative way of actually having some kind of like subsection behavior, and I think we hinted at this earlier on, it is okay to have these kind of expandable items. And the reason this is kind of okay is because it's not this huge context switch. You're not kind of completely replacing the contents of the drawer with something new and forcing the users to kind of keep up with where they're up to. But it's just kind of an in-place expand which shows the user slightly more options. So that we kind of think is cool.
And we have a little bit more guidance on what the exact touch targets should be, exactly how this should behave in the design guide. So if you go to developer.android.com/design/navigation-drawers.html, I think it is, or just search for navigation drawers Android design, you'll see some more details about exactly how this should behave. Basically, each line item should actually have 2 touch targets if section 1 has its own landing screen. But anyway, there's another alternative. Nick, do you want to talk about that one?
Sure. Yeah. So an alternative might be instead of like putting all your navigation in a drawer, you might break out to another kind of way of doing sub-navigation. So in this example on screen here, we kind of the screen you kind of get to when you switch sections. You can have some kind of more navigation type activity there as well as content. Or as we talked about earlier on, you could combine another navigation pattern. So for example, you might use the drawer for your major navigation sections and then use a spinner perhaps for kind of subsections of that. So don't feel like just because you are using a drawer that you have to have all your navigation kind of like forced right into there in the same place. Think about other ways to allow kind of subsection navigation.
And a good example of that, again, is Google Play Music. When you go into its drawer, you see things like Listen Now and then My Library. Under My Library, you see things like artists, genres, and so on. That could have been in the drawer, but that was actually placed into tabs. The nice thing about tabs is that you can actually really quickly swipe between those different subsections. So definitely think about different ways to do this. One thing I should mention here is we specifically called out, content 1, content 2 in these little wireframes because you don't want to just have purely navigational elements on here. Even, you should add a little bit of content to the screen. You don't want it to turn into a dashboard type thing where you just see a bunch of big icons or a bunch of big text blocks. And one of the ways you could do that obviously is to show content. Another is to just show images, show dynamic images representing that section. I think an example of that is Google Play Newsstand. I don't remember off the top of my head, but definitely don't just throw text on the screen. That's
you're talking about the Explore tab, the fifth tab on it's a nice example.
Exactly. All right, our 8th item here is bad drawer transitions. So there are a couple of things that this involves. When we say transition, we both mean the animation, the actual visual change, as well as kind of the transition from one screen that has a drawer to another screen that doesn't. And actually, I think the next 2 items are related to this. But basically, when you, let's say you open up the drawer and you touch section 1, you shouldn't actually be taken to a new screen with an up caret. Basically, there's a strong guidance that says any screens that are represented in the drawer, so for example here, section 1, section 2, section 3, and so on, when you actually get to those screens, they should also show the drawer indicator. So the first issue here is that you don't actually see the drawer indicator. You see this up caret instead. So that would be incorrect. But another, I guess, slightly more subtle aspect of this is the transition. When you go between section 1 and section 2, you shouldn't see the standard default zoom up transition that takes you to a new, or that you see when diving into, like, into content or showing a new activity, showing a new screen. You should first of all try to suppress that transition, so it should be really fluid. It's almost like, you touch something, the drawer closes, and then the content of the section you just selected just kind of fades in or appears. It shouldn't be this jarring kind of zoom up animation that changes the action bar and does all this stuff. Another thing to think about, I guess more for developers, is, and this is a question that we get all the time, is should I have a multiple activity or multiple fragment app when I'm using the drawer? And there's no easy answer. There's no right answer. It really depends on the situation. So if you guys have, I guess, suggestions for the developers out there, feel free to comment. My suggestion would be just kind of examine the difficulties and whether or not it makes sense for your app. I think by default start with multiple activities with replacing the transition, but having a single activity with multiple fragments, that is possible as well. Okay, should we move on?
Yeah, I think we've just got a good example here. So that just reinforcing that point that every section which appears in the drawer, you'd expect to have the drawer affordance shown on the screen, and other sections should show the up caret. Yeah.
So related to that is never showing the up caret, and this is really kind of the converse of that, or the inverse of that, whatever it is. You should, so like we said, anything that is represented in the drawer should show the drawer indicator. But things that aren't represented in the drawer, for example, here we're looking at a specific piece of content. We've now dove into a specific news story, for example. At this point, the drawer indicator shouldn't be there. You should instead show the up caret, because you're now in kind of a deeper section or a deeper part of the app within one of the sections in the drawer. And so instead of doing like this, something like this, you should obviously show the up caret. But what you can do to still expose the drawer is allow an edge swipe. And again, this is something that's in our documentation, in our design guidelines. You don't necessarily have to show the edge or the 3 little line indicator, the navigation drawer indicator, to have a drawer. In this case, having the drawer there is more kind of like a power user feature. For folks that discover that gesture, great. For those that don't, that's not so great, but they always have that ability to navigate to those other sections by pressing up. So you're not really keeping functionality from a certain class of users. You're really just kind of adding additional functionality for power users.
I guess there's kind of two competing things, like competing for the same space. You want the user to have the hierarchical navigation, to have that strong sense that it's going to keep you within the app and go to a parent type screen. So you want to have the up caret. While the drawer, one of the great facilities of the drawer is that you can have it available to you elsewhere to do these cross-cutting navigation gestures. So our advice to resolve those two kind of competing things is to show the up caret, but allow the edge gesture. And interesting kind of implementation detail, I guess, is what you do if someone does edge swipe the drawer open. I think a really nice way to do this is if you take a look at the way Google Play Newsstand does this, is they'll show the up caret, and as you edge swipe out to open the drawer, they'll crossfade the caret into the open drawer kind of affordance. So it makes sense that when you kind of look at the screen, oh yeah, that's the drawer open, I know that touching that's going to close it. Mm-hmm. Or when you look at the content screen, you have that up affordance, give you that stability of expectation of navigation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Should we move on to our last anti-pattern?
Yeah, in at 10.
Do you want to talk about this one, Nick?
Yeah, for sure. So the last one we're going to pick out is using kind of right side navigation. We touched on this slightly at the top of the show. There's a strong kind of organizational theme in Android to have navigation activities on the left. and actions on the right. I guess with most kind of left to right languages, you scan the page in one way, and it kind of reinforces that hierarchy, that this is kind of your navigation, your hierarchy, kind of your top level things, and then content is going to be on the right hand side. So it's perfectly valid. Say, like on this example here, we're showing a tablet which has kind of a larger screen available to it to show something kind of persistently. So you wouldn't want to put that on the right hand side. You want to keep that left aligned to go with that general organization of nav on the left.
Yep. So basically, here's the bad screenshot. Here's the good screenshot. This really works with both navigation. You shouldn't have navigation drawers on the right, as well as master detail scenarios. You shouldn't have the master on the right. You should really have master on the left. It should really read left to right. And obviously in RTL locales, like I guess in if your languages in Hebrew or Arabic, this would be flipped.
Yeah, so use like the gravity start and end rather than left and right. For the
exactly.
problems.
So those are the 10 more anti-patterns for navigation that we wanted to talk about today. I guess it's both kind of navigation and app structure, if you will. If you have any more anti-patterns, if this wasn't kind of, well, this obviously wasn't a comprehensive, exhaustive list, but if you have any more anti-patterns that you want to share, feel free to let us know in the comments, or just post something to Google Plus with the hashtag #AndroidDev, and we'll take a look and possibly comment. So with that, thanks again for joining Android Design in Action. As always, I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
And thanks from me, Nick Butcher.
See you guys next time.